She was the face of the 60s, the queen of the rock and roll era, and the inspiration for three of the greatest love songs ever written. For decades, the story of Pattie Boyd, George Harrison, and Eric Clapton was sold as rock's ultimate love triangle, a mythic tale of passion and romance. The world heard Something, Layla, and Wonderful Tonight, and thought it knew the whole story. It sounded like a fairy tale set to a legendary soundtrack. But now, at 80 years old, Pattie Boyd is setting the record straight. And it's not a fairy tale. It's a cautionary one. In her tell-all memoir and recent interviews, she's pulled back the curtain on her marriage to music icon Eric Clapton. It was a relationship defined not by the gentle romance of his ballads, but by a terrifying spiral of addiction, endless betrayal, and a psychological cruelty hidden from the world for years. This wasn't just a rough patch in a famous marriage. This was a private hell unfolding behind the scenes. This is the story of the muse who was forced to become a survivor, and of what happens when the music stops and a brutal reality kicks in. To the world, Pattie Boyd was the ultimate rock and roll muse. She lived a life most could only dream of, married to not one, but two of the most famous musicians on the planet. But behind the romantic lyrics and the velvet curtain of fame was a story of darkness she kept hidden for decades. Now, Pattie is breaking her silence on the disgusting truth of her marriage to Eric Clapton, revealing a nightmare of alcoholism, infidelity, and a single, unthinkable request that would shatter the fairy tale forever. This is the story you haven't heard. The truth behind the songs, and the resilience of a woman who had to lose everything to find herself. Before the darkness, there was a light so brilliant it lit up the world. Patricia Ann Boyd, with her signature gap-toothed smile, was the perfect image of swinging London. As a top model, she graced the covers of Vogue, and in 1964, that whirlwind life swept her onto the set of the Beatles' film A Hard Day's Night. She had just one line, but her presence was enough to captivate the quiet Beatle, George Harrison. He was shy, intense, and completely smitten. He asked her out on the spot. Even though she had a boyfriend, the connection was so immediate that she ended that relationship to be with him. They married in 1966, a union that seemed to seal the fairy tale. Pattie Boyd was now the wife of a Beatle, placing her at the absolute pinnacle of pop culture royalty. Their life at Kin Fawns, their psychedelic bungalow in Surrey, was an open house for rock's elite. It was a world of celebrity friends, spiritual, quests, and wild creativity. Inspired by his love for Pattie, George wrote what Frank Sinatra would later call the greatest love song of the past 50 years. Something. To the world, they were the perfect couple. But even in these golden years, cracks were showing. The pressure of being a Beatle was immense. George grew moody and withdrawn, swinging between deep meditation and binges of drugs and partying. His spiritual journey, once something they shared, became a solo obsession that left Pattie feeling utterly alone and neglected. In her autobiography, Wonderful Tonight, she recalls how his search for enlightenment led to a deep emotional distance, leaving her isolated inside a life that everyone else envied. The home that was once a haven started to feel more like a golden cage. George's moods darkened, and his infidelities became more frequent. The most devastating blow, however, came not from a stranger, but from inside their tightest circle. George began an affair with Maureen Starr, the wife of his bandmate and close friend Ringo. For Pattie, this was the ultimate betrayal. It wasn't just cheating, it shattered the trust that held their world together. The dream had curdled into a painful reality. And into this emotional void stepped another man, George's best friend, ready to claim her for himself. Among the frequent guests at their home was a man who watched Pattie with a quiet, burning intensity. Eric Clapton. Clapton wasn't just a visitor. He was a guitar god and one of George's closest friends. They collaborated on tracks like the Beatles' While My Guitar Gently Weeps, where Clapton played the iconic solo. But beneath their friendship, a dangerous obsession was growing. Clapton had fallen desperately in love with his best friend's wife. He started writing her secret, passionate letters, signing them Layla. In one, he confessed his torment, asking if she still loved her husband and pleading, "If you don't want me, please don't hang me on. It's killing me." Pattie, thinking it was from a weird fan, even showed it to George with a laugh. It was only when Eric called her that she realized the truth, shocking her with the depth of his feelings. Things exploded at a party where Clapton confronted George directly, brazenly telling him, "I'm in love with your wife." George, furious, turned to Pattie and asked, "Well, who are you going with?" Overwhelmed and horrified, Pattie stayed with her husband. Rejected and devastated, Clapton plunged into a heroin addiction that took him out of the music scene for 3 years. It was in this dark haze of despair that his unrequited love erupted into one of rock's most legendary albums, Layla and Other Assorted Love Songs. The title track, Layla, was a raw, 7-minute primal scream of pain and desire. He played the finished song for her in his apartment, a moment she later described as both magical and terrifying. The music was a beautiful, powerful declaration of love, but it was also a heavy burden that put her at the center of a conflict between two men she cared for. By 1974, Pattie's marriage to George was impossible to save. The affairs and the emotional distance were too much. She decided to leave. Clapton, recently out of his drug-fueled exile, saw his chance. He pursued her again, and this time, emotionally exhausted, she finally gave in. They married in 1979. George Harrison not only gave his blessing but showed up to their wedding party, famously calling Clapton his husband-in-law. It seemed like the dramatic, romantic finale to rock's greatest love story. But Pattie hadn't escaped the storm. She had just walked into its eye. The wedding bells in 1979 weren't the start of a happy ending. They were the start of a decade-long nightmare. The poetic letters and passionate music quickly dissolved into the ugly reality of living with a full-blown alcoholic. Clapton's drinking spiraled almost immediately. In her memoir, Pattie describes how his life and hers began to revolve around the 5-hour cycles it took for his body to demand more alcohol. He was downing 2 bottles of brandy a day, a habit that turned the brilliant musician into a volatile, abusive stranger. She dreaded the sound of his stumbling footsteps on the stairs, knowing it could lead to verbal tirades or frightening behavior. The romantic hero who wrote Wonderful Tonight was gone, replaced by a man who could be incredibly cruel. He insulted her, belittled her, made her feel worthless. She has described him kicking her across a room while drunk. The public saw a guitar god. She lived with a man who sometimes had to perform lying on his back because he was so intoxicated. The marriage that was supposed to be a sanctuary had become a prison. On top of the abuse, Clapton's infidelity was relentless. He had numerous affairs, especially on tour, leaving Pattie feeling humiliated and alone. But the final betrayal was tied to Pattie's deepest, most private pain, her struggle with infertility. For years, with both George and Eric, Pattie had longed for a child. She and Eric endured multiple grueling, heartbreaking rounds of IVF, all of which failed. It was a source of profound sadness for her. And it was during this exact time, as she was putting her body and soul through hell to have their baby, that Eric delivered the most crushing betrayals of all. First, he had an affair with a studio manager, Yvonne Kelly, resulting in a daughter, Ruth, born in 1985. Pattie wouldn't find out about her until years later. But the second betrayal happened while they were still married, and he confessed it to her face. He had been having an affair with Italian model Lori Del Santo, and in 1986, she gave birth to his son, Connor. Pattie was still his wife, still desperately trying for a child of her own. when he admitted it. She called the moment a stab in the heart, but the cruelty didn't stop there. In an act of unbelievable selfishness, Eric made an unthinkable request. He suggested they could all work something out. He actually asked Pattie if his son Connor could come and live with them. He wanted her, his wife, who was barren, to help raise the son he'd just had with his mistress. This was the disgusting truth. A request so cruel it laid bare the complete emptiness at the heart of their relationship. For Pattie, it was the final straw. She knew she couldn't do it. To agree would be to destroy what was left of her spirit. She told him it would never work. The marriage was over, finalized in 1989. For Pattie Boyd, escaping wasn't just a choice, it was survival. Leaving Eric Clapton wasn't just the end of a marriage, it was the end of an identity. For over 20 years, she'd been Mrs. Harrison or Mrs. Clapton. Now she was neither. The divorce left her in a free fall, facing a terrifying question. Who am I? The years of trauma and betrayal finally caught up to her, leading to a breakdown. Realizing she couldn't do it alone, she started years of therapy, a difficult journey to reclaim herself and learn to believe in her own worth again. A crucial part of her healing was rediscovering a passion that had been there all along: photography. Throughout her years with the Beatles and Clapton, she always had a camera, capturing intimate, behind-the-scenes moments. These weren't just snapshots. They were her life, seen through her eyes. Her story, waiting to be told. She began curating, her vast archive holding exhibitions around the world. The photos offered a unique personal glimpse into a world few had ever seen: candid shots of George in India, portraits of Eric on tour, unguarded moments with friends like Mick Jagger. The exhibitions were a hit, giving her a professional identity that was entirely her own. She was no longer just the muse, she was the artist. Then, in 2007, she took the ultimate step in reclaiming her story by publishing her autobiography, Wonderful Tonight. For the first time, she told her truth in her own words. The book was a bestseller, a raw and honest account of the alcoholism, the abuse, and the heartbreak. By laying her secrets bare, she finally let go of the pain that had defined her for so long. Now in her 80s, Pattie Boyd has found a peace that once seemed impossible. She lives a quiet life, focused on her photography. She even found love again, marrying property developer Rod Weston in 2015, her partner for decades. Her relationship with Eric Clapton is distant but civil. He has since admitted that his addictions made him lose control and destroy the most important relationships in his life, including his with Pattie. Pattie Boyd's story is a powerful lesson in resilience. It's a stark reminder that behind the rock and roll mythology, there are real people with real pain. She survived the crushing pressure of fame, the heartbreak of 2 divorces from musical legends, and the deep grief of betrayal. And she didn't just disappear. She found her voice, reclaimed her story, and transformed herself from a legendary muse into the author of her own life. If you found this story as compelling as we did, consider subscribing to our channel for more hidden truths behind the music. The saga of Pattie Boyd, George Harrison, and Eric Clapton is so much more than a simple love triangle. The stunning beauty of the music often hid a dark, ugly, and painful reality. The love wasn't always as pure as the lyrics, and the muse was a real woman whose heart was broken again and again. So can you still hear Layla or Wonderful Tonight the same way, knowing the pain and cruelty that were tangled up in their creation? That's a question every fan has to answer for themselves. But to remember Pattie Boyd only for her pain is to miss the whole point. Her life is a masterclass in survival. She endured, she healed, and in the end, she won. She forced the world to see her not just as Layla, but as Pattie, a survivor, an artist and a woman of incredible strength who finally found something more valuable than being a muse. She found herself.